It's November 29th, 2005. We're in the US, in southern Ohio, where 49-year-old John Hicks is in a very rare position. He knows exactly when, where, and how he will die. At 6:25 a.m, he eats his last breakfast. Just 2 sweet rolls. 10 minutes later, he brushes his teeth for the final time and takes one last shower. Around 8 a.m, Hicks calls his mother. They speak for 4 minutes and then say their final goodbyes. John hangs up the phone and knows he'll never pick it up again. At 10:20, the moment arrives. Strapped to a gurney, John laughs out loud for the final time in his life and cries, "Hallelujah." And then, right on schedule, Hicks dies. Or, more specifically, he's killed. Back in 1985, high on cocaine, Hicks strangled his mother-in-law to death and suffocated his 5-year-old stepdaughter. He then tried, and failed, to dismember the little girl's body in his bathtub. All this was so that Hicks could steal money from his mother-in-law and silence his stepdaughter before she could talk to police. It was a horrific crime, and 20 years later, the state of Ohio repaid the favour. In November, after all those years on death row, John Hicks was executed by lethal injection, the most common form of capital punishment in the US today. Like many on death row, Hicks entered his final 24 hours knowing how his life would end. Fast forward to the present day, and little has changed. Over 2,000 prisoners, all convicted murderers, sit behind bars in America, waiting for their turn to die. Right now, 27 states in the US use the death penalty, and despite some slight variations between them, the timeline leading up to execution is pretty much the same for all death row inmates, both men and women. It involves a strange mix of laws, traditions, and fleeting moments of humanity that define the end of their lives in prison. This is what happens on those final hours on death row. In the US, the death penalty is reserved for cases that involved aggravated murder. You can't be sentenced to death without taking a life. However, what counts as aggravated depends on the state. California, for instance, lists 22 different aggravating factors that can turn a murder into a death penalty case. Some factors are universal. Murder committed alongside robbery, or SA, can invoke the death sentence, as can the murder of an on-duty police officer or a child. And once the conviction lands, the prisoner's suffering begins almost immediately. Death row usually means solitary confinement, and in most states, inmates are locked inside their cells for around 22 hours a day. And these cells aren't pretty either. Inmates often just get a single bed, a sink, a toilet, and maybe a writing table if they're lucky. In many prisons, these cells have no windows and get no natural light whatsoever. So when the prison decides that it's bedtime, inmates are submerged in total darkness, left only with their thoughts. Prisoners are allowed to see visitors 1 to 3 times a week, depending on the state, but only through a glass window. No touching allowed. This means that for some inmates, the last time they felt human skin was the day that they were sentenced, and the next time will likely be when the doctor slides a needle into their arm on execution day. Even when inmates leave their cell, they're escorted around in full-body restraints or handcuffs, and all the while they're under constant watch, either by prison guards or CCTV. The few luxuries they may or may not be allowed all depend on the state. In Oregon, for instance, death row inmates can watch television or buy radios and MP3 players. Elsewhere, they might be able to spend money given to them by their families or friends at the prison canteen. Some states let inmates work inside the death row unit. Many more let them go to religious services. But almost all inmates get an hour a day for exercise, whether that's walking, jogging, or in some states, like North Carolina, even playing basketball with other death row inmates. It's in these fleeting moments together that inmates find a way to connect as the years pass them by. Marion Bowman Jr., an inmate executed earlier this year in South Carolina, told The Guardian that prisoners often looked out for each other. In the corridors, outside their cells, they remembered birthdays, they gave advice, and they shared a few brief words each time to comfort each other in the shadow of their impending executions. Bowman, who's been behind bars for 24 years, said, quote, "These people have helped me survive this. People who never would have gotten together on the outside. It was so different but still have so much humanity in common. Some say they never had a friend until they came here. There's no such thing as unredeemable. Once a death row prisoner loses every appeal in their case and the chance of freedom slips away for good, the dreaded news arrives: an execution date. The inmate is told the exact day and time their life will end, usually about a month in advance, and from this day on, everything changes. The prisoner is moved to execution watch. This means they go to a new cell and often lose the few basic privileges that they've managed to hold on to until this point. Other than a quick shower, the prisoner spends 24 hours a day locked inside this new cell, with guards stationed right outside the door at all times. Sometimes, this cell is separated from the execution chamber by just a single wall. The prisoner's mail, if they get any, is usually photocopied for them, and the originals are stored away by prison authorities. This is to stop anyone from smuggling in drug-soaked paper. Between 24 and 48 hours before execution, most inmates suddenly get to enjoy a very famous privilege: the last meal. The last meal is, of course, one of death row's most famous aspects, especially across pop culture, but it isn't actually a legal right. Instead, it's a tradition that goes back centuries. Some people say the last meal has religious roots, that it was influenced by the Last Supper or ancient funeral offerings. Others say that it's just symbolic, a way for the state to soften the blow of killing one of its own citizens. The rules for the last meal vary by state. Some allow a meal ordered from a local restaurant, others prepare it in-house, and budgets vary too. In Oklahoma, the limit is $25. In Florida, it's $40. Oklahoma's policy says every reasonable effort to accommodate the last meal request shall be made, but it must be eaten within 4 hours. Some requests have gone down in history for how strange or gluttonous they ended up being. The serial killer John Wayne Gacy, for instance, asked for a bucket of KFC, 12 fried shrimp, and a pound of strawberries in 1994. Perhaps, unsurprisingly, he'd managed 3 KFC restaurants before being convicted. Ronnie Lee Gardner, who was executed by firing squad in Utah in 2010, asked for steak, lobster tail, and apple pie with vanilla ice cream. And he asked to eat all of this while watching the Lord of the Rings trilogy. And in 2022, Matthew Reeves refused the last meal altogether and just asked for a bottle of Sprite. In Texas, however, there's no last meal at all, thanks to one controversial inmate. In 2011, the murderer and white supremacist Lawrence Brewer ordered a huge and expensive feast before his execution. And brace yourselves, it included 2 fried chicken steaks, a triple bacon cheeseburger, a cheese omelette loaded with beef and jalapenos, a bowl of fried okra, half a loaf of white bread, a pound of barbecued meat, a meat pizza, a pint of vanilla ice cream, 3 root beers, and more. When it arrived, though, Brewer didn't take a single bite. We don't know whether this was because of nerves or it was just an attempt to anger the authorities, but if it was the latter, it worked. The move enraged John Whitmire, a Texas state senator, who the very next day demanded that the Texas Department of Criminal Justice put an end to last meals altogether. John got his way, and since then, death row inmates in Texas have been eating the same cafeteria food as all the other prisoners. Regardless, very few death row inmates can actually stomach their last meal. When they know that they'll be executed soon after they finish, it can be quite hard to work up an appetite. John Sheldon, a death penalty lawyer in Virginia, told The Guardian in 2011, "I don't know anybody who has eaten the last meal. In my experience, it's unlikely that someone is going to want to be hungry and is going to want a meal. It's either not ordered, or it's ordered and it's not eaten." With the last meal likely left untouched, we now come down to the last few hours for the death row inmate. On the morning of their execution, the prisoner is strip searched and given a clean set of clothes. They're usually allowed to meet a small group of people, including friends, family, attorneys, and spiritual advisors, or make a final goodbye phone call to their loved ones. If the inmate sees any of these people again, it will be through the glass window, separating the witnesses from the execution room. Eventually, the condemned is escorted to the execution chamber. This is usually just minutes before the time they're scheduled to die, but as you can imagine, not everyone goes quietly. On April 29th, 2014, Clayton Lockett, who was sentenced to death for the brutal murder of 19-year-old Stephanie Naiman, tried to end his life hours before his execution. He created a noose from his bedsheets, pulled the blade from a safety razor to cut his arms, and swallowed a stash of hoarded pills. When guards arrived at 5:06 a.m, he pulled a blanket over his head and refused to get up. In the end, Lockett was literally dragged from his cell and to the execution room. For most prisoners who make it this far, the final room looks the same. If they've chosen or been assigned lethal injection, they'll be led into a small theatre-like space with a gurney in the centre. This will be their deathbed. On the other side of the room will be a window looking into the witness room. Only certain people are allowed to witness the execution itself. These usually include the close family of the prisoner and of the victim, the prison warden, a chaplain or spiritual advisor, and some journalists. The families of the victim and prisoner are usually kept apart in different rooms, and all witnesses are briefed on how the execution will play out, and they're told to remain silent throughout the whole procedure. In some states, if the witness list is longer than the room can hold, an overflow space is set up somewhere else in the prison, and from there, they can watch the execution on CCTV instead. Once the prisoner has been led inside the execution room and strapped down on the gurney, they can take part in one final death row ritual, the final statement. Just like the last meal though, the final statement actually isn't a constitutional right, and instead it's a tradition that far predates America itself. Those about to be executed in England almost as far back as the 14th century were allowed to make a final statement to the public, and this tradition was brought over by settlers to the New World. In the same way, the inmate's final statement is their last chance to address the world before they die. And even though the crowd of witnesses is far smaller than it would have been in 14th century England, the inmate's last words are transcribed, reviewed by the warden, and eventually released to the press. This means that they can potentially reach people all over the world. There are some rules though. Once the inmate is given the microphone, or a piece of paper if they're allowed to write it down, their final statement must be short. It can't contain curse words, and the inmate can't intentionally direct insults at the witnesses either. If they try, the microphone will be cut off without ceremony. Still, some inmates, perhaps hoping their words will be published post-mortem, have made some very unique last statements over the years. In 1984, Thomas Andy Barefoot said, "I hope that one day we can look back on the evil that we're doing right now like the witches we burned at the stake. I want everyone to know that I hold nothing against them. I forgive them all." In 1987, Jimmy Glass kept it simple. He just said, "I'd rather be fishing." In 2007, James Lewis Jackson said, "Murder me. I'm ready to roll. Time to get this party started." And in 2012, Robert Charles Towery went for something even more abstract. He said, "I love my family. Potato, potato, potato." A study of executions in Missouri between 1995 and 2011 found that most prisoners used their last words to say "I love you" to family and friends, to talk about their religion, or in some cases, to state their innocence one last time. Others just admit their guilt outright, usually to seek forgiveness. Guilty or not, when the time finally arrives, it's taken most prisoners at least a decade to get there, and now everything is finally prepared, everyone is in place, and the execution can proceed. Some states still let prisoners choose death by electrocution, gas chamber, firing squad, or hanging, but in this video we're talking about the lethal injection because it's by far the most common method of execution in the US by a long shot. So, strapped to the gurney by their ankles and wrists, the inmate is connected to an electrocardiogram machine which monitors their heart until it stops. In some cases, the prisoner's head is left unrestrained so that they can turn and see the witnesses one last time. Medical staff then insert 2 IV lines into the inmate's arm. The execution team remains out of sight, usually behind a curtain, in a separate room, wearing hoodies to hide their identities. Some states have multiple executioners. Each of them injects a line, but only one is given the lethal dose. This way, the executioners never know who actually killed the inmate. After all, it's worth bearing in mind that there really isn't a job title of executioner. The deed is done by ordinary prison or medical employees when the time comes. The drugs are given one by one. First comes sodium thiopental, a powerful sedative that renders the prisoner unconscious. This drug alone can actually be enough to kill the inmate by shutting down their respiratory system, much like an opioid overdose. In recent years, however, midazolam has been switched out, which controversially may not actually induce a state of unconscious sedation. Just to make sure though that death definitely arrives, 2 more drugs are administered. Next is pancuronium bromide, or pavulon, which within minutes paralyzes the body, including the diaphragm, and effectively causes the inmate to suffocate. And finally, you have potassium chloride, which stops the inmate's heart by interfering with its electrical signals and triggers a heart attack. The first drug knocks you out so you don't suffer and potentially kills you. The next 2 drugs make sure you die while unconscious. The entire process, from first injection to death, usually takes less than 10 minutes. If the inmate were awake, it would feel like being buried alive. Their body would shut down and their lungs would be fighting for air as they suffocated to death. A few minutes after the last drug courses through the inmate's veins, a doctor or medical worker checks the prisoner's vital signs. They immediately warn the prison warden if they show signs of pain or suffering, and if so, the warden should stop the execution, otherwise the inmate is declared dead. For the witnesses, this is a tense and possibly harrowing period of time. In a 2001 article, Joseph Ross, a former volunteer chaplain at the Indiana State Prison, described the execution of one inmate he came to know. Quote, "We sat there for a few minutes, surrounded by several guards, until the blinds snapped open. Jerry was lying on the gurney with an IV inserted into his left arm, which hung off the side. His glasses were still on. He looked towards us and smiled. With his arms strapped to the gurney, he managed a small wave of his left hand from which he hung a handcuff. His head remained turned towards us, looking through the window. After a few moments, he coughed, convulsed, gagged, and strained against the straps. These painful seconds stretched into years. Finally, his convulsions stopped. He lay still, his head back, mouth open. Some of the witnesses sobbed. The blinds snapped shut." When the inmate is confirmed dead, the witnesses are escorted out. Some speak to reporters in a designated press area, and all of them sign official documents to confirm that the execution took place. Medical examiners then come in and take pictures of the dead body. First, they photograph the body in the gurney restraints, and then unrestrained, then sealed in a body bag, and then finally in the bag itself. Afterwards, there might be an autopsy on the body if needed, but otherwise the remains are claimed by the inmate's family or interred by the state if nobody comes to get them. And so, after decades of waiting and after days of careful procedures and age-old traditions, the life of the death row inmate finally comes to an end. Justice, as many will say, has been served at last. The death penalty, however, at least in the US, is steeped in controversy. A 2024 Gallup poll, for instance, found the split between Americans who support the death penalty and those who don't is almost exactly 50-50. The majority of those in the survey, 53%, are in favour of the death penalty. Most death row inmates are convicted for appalling crimes, and as a result, many people are happy for them to suffer and die for these crimes. And it can definitely seem like a fitting eye for an eye type punishment. But what if the punishment goes wrong? Lethal injection is the world's newest method of execution, one designed to be the most humane option. First used in the US in 1982, it's now what most death row inmates opt for in the end. But despite that, the lethal injection can still be botched. You might remember Clayton Lockett, the gentleman who tried to take his own life before his execution in Oklahoma in 2014. Well, his case was a tragic example of a botched execution. It did not go to plan whatsoever. When Lockett was strapped to the gurney, medical staff tried and failed to insert the IV needle multiple times. They tried his arms, feet, collarbone and groin, and at one point, the blood from Lockett's arteries spurted blood all over one of the doctors. Even once the drugs had been administered, they didn't actually work properly. As witnesses looked on in horror, Clayton Lockett convulsed, gagged, and writhed violently on the gurney. He was conscious and in visible agony, and he even managed to let out some muffled words. The witnesses described it as torture. As it turned out, the medical staff had substituted the usual anaesthetic, sodium thiopental, which renders the victim properly unconscious, for another drug called midazolam, which is only a sedative. The sodium thiopental was designed to stop the inmate feeling the pain of the potassium chloride, which is the heart stopper, the third drug, but instead the new replacement of midazolam failed, and so Lockett was subjected to a slow and painful death while more or less awake. To make things worse, the IV line wasn't properly in his bloodstream, and so none of these drugs were actually administered properly and instead were just dumped into his thigh, leading what should have been a 10-minute execution to nearly an hour. Incidents like this could become more common in America's death penalty states too, as more suppliers of the necessary lethal injection drugs refused to provide them for executions. In 2010, the maker of sodium thiopental, called Hospira, now part of Pfizer, stopped production in the US due to issues getting hold of raw materials. The company tried to restart production in Italy, but the country blocked it unless it could prove that the drug wasn't being used for the executions, and of course, Hospira couldn't do this. That same year, the Mumbai-based company KM Pharmaceuticals also stopped selling sodium thiopental to the US, and then in 2011, the UK made it illegal to export drugs for use in capital punishment. Today, over 60 pharmaceutical companies around the world refuse to let their drugs be used for executions. This has left senior prison authorities in death penalty states searching far and wide for suppliers, with countless setbacks along the way. Some states have tried to make the drugs on their own. After all, states like Indiana don't have any laws that dictate which drugs should be used in lethal injection. They just say that the drugs must be injected and be sufficient to kill the inmate. Other states have brought in laws to keep the identity of death penalty drug suppliers a secret in the hope that it will resume the flow. And some, like South Carolina, have even brought back death by firing squad in recent years to cover the shortfall. Regardless, critics say these difficulties can mean either the execution is more at risk of being botched when it actually happens, or that they spend longer on death row as the authorities look for a way to execute them. After all, the time spent waiting in prison, critics say, is often the worst part. The average time that death row inmates must wait in prison for their execution in the US is over 10 years, and more than half of all current death row inmates have been there for over 18 years, at least according to the Death Penalty Information Center. And some, like Florida inmate Gary Alvord, waited more than 40 years before dying in prison of natural causes. And through it all, some of them suffer needlessly. Since 1973, at least 200 people have been exonerated from death row in the US, and studies suggest that 4% of those sentenced may be innocent. And as we know, these years on death row aren't exactly spent in luxury. Decades of solitary confinement take a toll on the human mind and body. Inmates often suffer from things like muscle atrophy, digestion issues, and reduced immune system function, as well as mood swings, psychosis, self-harm, rage, and severe depression. Researchers have labelled this level of suffering as the death row phenomenon. The European Court of Human Rights defines the death row phenomenon as a prolonged period of time spent on death row in extreme conditions, with the ever-present and mounting anguish of awaiting implementation of the death penalty or the actual conditions on death row themselves. In many cases, the death row phenomenon can cause inmates to take their own lives, and as a result, they're constantly surveilled by prison guards for any warning signs that they're planning on checking out. Should they try to end their own life, they're stopped, ironically, so that the state can carry out their execution instead. In other cases, death row inmates have decided to waive the appeals to their convictions just to bring their execution date closer and put an end to their suffering. Dr. Janice Whitlock, a psychologist and Cornell research scientist emerita, told The Guardian about an inmate she evaluated in 2015 called Richard Moore, saying, quote, "He said it was ironic and a sign of humanity's lack of evolution that the greatest cruelty he experienced was in the weeks before he was slated to die." Whitlock added that death row inmates like Moore are constantly surveilled for signs of suicidality. She said, quote, "You're talking draconian and barbaric steps to keep somebody from ending their own life so you can execute them. I can't wrap my brain around that." Others, including 27 US states and more than 50 countries like China, Japan, Vietnam and Saudi Arabia, however, have already quite comfortably wrapped their brains around it. The suffering is part of the punishment. It's been dealt out in response to unspeakable crimes that these inmates have been convicted of, and it serves to stop other criminals from following suit. Whether these death row inmates actually deserve to suffer in this way or not, well, we'll leave that up to you.
In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout,